we can start with an invocation, and I'll ask one of the participants to volunteer to the opening invocation before we can start.
Okay.
Yeah. So good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, sisters. Welcome again to this session we have today. And before we invite Joan back, I would like to ask one of you to please volunteer to do the opening invocation today before we can begin. So anyone who would like to do the invocation?
Hi, Elsa.
Hermo? Hermo, can you please do the invocation? I don't know if she can hear me. Okay, January, please go ahead.
Buenos días, hermana.
Good morning, sisters. Good afternoon and good evening. How is everyone? We cannot hear January at the moment.
I think she's frozen.
¿Me escuchan?
Can you
Yes.
hear me?
Yes. January, maybe you can put your video off so that the sound is better.
Hola, ¿me escuchan?
Hello, can you hear me now?
Yes, January, but because you keep cutting off, can you put off your video so that the sound is better?
Okay. Buenos días, amigas.
Okay, good morning, friends and sisters. I would like for you to bow your heads to ask God that this meeting be productive and to give us more knowledge, and also to learn everything that we're going to be exposed to today through our agenda. So, Heavenly Father, we thank you for all of your good deeds and for allowing us to have one more year together and for having one more day and the ability to be together here at this meeting with Femi. We thank you, Lord, for allowing us to be at this class session, and we ask that everything that we do today be according to your will, and that this session be very productive, and that all of the knowledge we learn from this session can be for our good work and to be able to use it in everything that we plan to do. We also ask for good health and for your guidance, and so that everything is according to your wishes. Amen. Thank you, sisters.
Thank you so much, January, for that opening prayer. And so just before we invite Joan back, I'll read her bio so that we know a little bit about her before she comes. So Joan Carling is an Indigenous activist from the Cordillera, Philippines. She has been working on Indigenous issues at the grassroots to international levels for more than 20 years in advancing the rights and aspirations of Indigenous peoples. She worked with Indigenous organizations in the Philippines for more than 10 years and led the Asia Indigenous Peoples Pact, AIPP, as its Secretary General from 2009 to 2016. She was an expert member of the UN Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues from 2014 to 2016. Ms. Carling received a UN Champions of the Earth Lifetime Achievement Award from the UN Environment in September 2018. Ms. Carling has been the co-convener of the Indigenous Peoples Media Group on Sustainable Development from March 2017 to December 2021. And she's currently the director of the Indigenous Peoples Rights International, IPRI. So welcome, Joanne. Thank you for being here with us today. And thank you for always accepting our invitation to come and speak to the students at the Global Leadership School. And so Joanne is going to be talking to us about the implementation of the UN DRIP through international work with a special focus or reference to the SDGs. So Joanne, welcome.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Winnie. It's always a pleasure for me to take part in the Leadership School of FIMI. It wasn't mentioned in my CV, but I'm actually in the board of FIMI. And so it's like I said, it's my commitment to be supporting also the work of FIMI. And one of the important work of FIMI is this leadership school. So I'm always happy also to have Elsa with us, because this is really a platform where we build the capacities of Indigenous leaders, women leaders. So with that, I request Winnie or any of the FIMI folks to put my PowerPoint presentation. And I'll put off my video because I'm not sure of the stability of my connection. So if you don't mind, I'll put off my video.
All right.
So, but maybe while waiting for the presentation to be put on the screen, can I ask the participants to put in the chat box, when you hear of development and rights, what comes to your mind in 1 or 2 words? What comes to your mind when you hear the words development and rights? Can you put in the chat, please, to kick off our discussion? May I ask the participants, what is development for you, and how is development related to rights? Yeah, let's give some time, okay? I don't see anyone responding to the chat box. I know English is not your first language, but it's just 1 or 2 words that comes to your mind when you hear the term development or rights. Can you hear me? I don't see anyone making any response.
Yes, we can hear you. I think they might be typing.
Okay, now I see one. Okay, who else can share what development is for you, or what's the connection of development and rights? Okay. Anyone will give 1 minute for others to also share their thoughts. What is development? Okay. Anyone else?
Joanne,
Yes.
there's one participant who has her hand up.
Okay. Bridani, can you say what development is? Bridani. I hope I pronounce your name right. Bridani?
Unfortunately, we could not hear Brittany's voice.
Oh,
Uh,
okay, I think it was a mistaken.
yeah,
Um,
I think she's.
yeah.
Brittany writes, sisters, I apologize. I have problems with my connection.
Brittany, I think you can just write on the chat also, and we'll be able to get it.
This is the interpreter, Carmen. Can we ask that someone please read the comments in English so that they can be interpreted? Oh, okay, well,
The question is what is
thank you.
development for you, and or the link of development and rights. So the responses so far include first from development is more employment opportunity or job. It also means infrastructures, better health services, good education, access to services. And then when I hear the word development, I think of industrialization. And then from Elsa, our indigenous peoples asked about what development for them is, right? Which is really a big problem for us, because we were never even asked what we think of development. It's a challenge actually. And then Hermanas disculpen tengo. I don't know, problemas. Problem with the connection.
Brittany says, sisters, I apologize. I have problems with connection.
A human right by virtue. Every human person and all peoples are entitled to participate in and contribute to development. Okay, and then there's a momento. Wait
This
a
is
minute.
Carmen, the interpreter again. I believe that our presenter is not hearing me. Can someone who can hear me please ask Joan Carling to access interpretation? Otherwise, you will not be able to hear interpretation of any comments. I can see her carrying on. Whitney, can you hear? Winnie or Joy, can you please help me ask our presenter to select a language? I will move on to the Spanish channel.
Access to services, industrialization, but there's also a response here where it mentions development as a matter of rights, and that the kind of development being pursued is violating our rights. So this is a very interesting comment, which we will note when we discuss the SDGs. So many of those responses are actually part of the
Ms. Carmen, can you
SDGs.
hear me?
Yes.
I apologize. This is Carmen Gomez, the interpreter. We need you to activate the interpretation so that you can hear the Spanish speakers when their comments are interpreted. So if you could please go to the globe that you have at the bottom of the screen and select English.
Yeah.
Tell me when that's done.
Okay. How many Spanish speaking participants do we have?
I don't know the number, but there are some, including Brittany, who's trying to make comments. So if you don't have the interpretation activated, you will not be able to hear my interpretation.
Okay, okay. Yeah, but I think they are having a problem with the connection.
We do have
That's what,
others. We do have other Spanish speakers.
yeah. Okay, okay. So with that comments on developments from our participants, we'll get back to this once we have gone through what the SDGs is all about and how it is linked to our rights as Indigenous peoples. So I will be giving an overview first on the SDGs, or it's known as the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development. And so for first is an overview, and then where are we now in terms of the implementation, and then what can we still do? How do we engage in this process? But before going to that, why is it also important for Indigenous peoples to engage in this process? So that is the flow of the presentation. I'll try to slow down and just present the main points so that at the end we will have more time for your questions. So I hope this is the way we can proceed. So let's first start with what are the general features of the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development. And first, when we say the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development, this is actually the product of a long discussion by member states, meaning governments that are member of the UN and other stakeholders, including Indigenous peoples, in the earlier part where the medium-term development plan was assessed, and that countries and governments agreed that we should continue with that track of development for peoples of the world. And so the SDG, they call it now the Sustainable Development Agenda 2030, meaning that this should be achieved by 2030. And it was adopted in September 2015 by the UN General Assembly, meaning it has an implementation period of 15 years, from 2015 to 2030. Okay, that's why it's called 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development. The main features of this is the 17 Sustainable Development Goals, which I will be presenting later, with 169 related targets, meaning that there are 17 interlinked Sustainable Development Goals that countries have committed to implement from 2015 to 2030. Then these SDGs, the 17 SDGs, are supported with what is called the means of implementation, which are the resources and partnerships necessary to reach the goals and targets. When we say resources, this includes the financial, technical, knowledge, right? These are resources that are needed to implement the 17 SDGs. In addition to this is a partnership between and among the different actors for development, meaning it should involve not only the governments, but also the civil society, academe, and what they call the private sector. The private sector includes business, investors, philanthropists, right? Those that have additional or other forms of resources that they can contribute to achieve the SDGs. So this is what is referred to as the means of implementation. Then, in order to ensure that the 17 SDGs do not remain as words or promises. The UN, the member states of the UN agreed to do what is called the follow-up and review, meaning this is a process of monitoring and the implementation of the SDGs. So this is a monitoring tool from the national, regional, and global level. So at the national level, which we will present later what these levels are, right? But the global level is known as the High Level Political Forum that is held at the UN headquarters in New York every year. So that is again the High Level Political Forum, which is a venue to discuss the progress or gaps in the implementation of the SDGs. Remember, the SDGs is up to 2030, is starting 2015. So we are now actually at the middle of the implementation of the SDGs. But is there significant progress? We will discuss that later, but just to say that we are already at the middle of implementation of the SDGs. Now, in addition to the 17 goals and targets, are 230 global indicators that will be used to measure progress. These are indicators, right? If like say, the target on education, what are the indicators that those targets are being met? We will show you an example later. Now, while this is an ambitious target set by the governments and very much needed, the challenge is that it is voluntary in nature, meaning each government, according to national circumstances, as they always say, will have to select what the targets that they will implement. Although they need to follow the 17 SDGs, they will still be selective on how they will implement the targets and the indicators. And it's voluntary in nature, thereby it's not obligatory for them to actually meet the targets set by the SDGs. Okay, so next slide, please. Next slide, please. So, okay, now these are the 17 goals. These are what the member states of the UN have agreed to do by 2030. The first is the goal 1 is no poverty. So meaning the goal is to end poverty. Now goal 2 is zero hunger or end hunger, that by 2030 there will be no more hungry people. And then third is good health and well-being. So that's health, target on health, good health for everyone. Then 4 is quality education for all without any discrimination. And 5 is gender equality, or what is also known as women's empowerment. And 6 is clean water and sanitation. 7 is affordable and clean energy, or access to energy, to clean energy for all. 8 is decent work and economic growth, meaning for us, decent work includes the recognition of our traditional occupations like hunting, food gathering, traditional fishing, and other livelihoods that we have, like shifting cultivation or rotational agriculture, for example. And then 9 includes industry, innovation, and infrastructure. Somebody mentioned a while ago industrialization, right? So 9 is dealing with that. And 10 is a very, very critical goal because it is reduced inequalities within the country and between countries, meaning there should be also a reduction of inequality of the rich countries and the poor countries. And within the country between the rich people and the poor. And this is one of the biggest achievement, if I may say, of the participation of indigenous peoples in the process of formulating the development goals. The 11th is the sustainable cities and communities, meaning that development should not only be in cities, and that cities should be sustainable, and that communities are also sustainable. So that not all services, for example, are concentrated in cities, but there is a distribution and access of basic services for all, not just limited in cities. And that the development path for cities and communities should be sustainable. And then we have goal 12, which is responsible consumption and production, meaning that we need to consider not producing too much waste, and that production should be based according to needs and not just generated by the objective for profit. Then that's goal 12. Goal 13 is climate action. So climate action is in line with the commitments of government under the climate negotiations, which is the climate change negotiations, right, of reducing carbon and also addressing all the impacts of climate change. Then 14 refers to life below water. This is also called the protection of the oceans, because this is necessary for the survival not only of humans but also marine life or marine biology. And then 6 marine ecosystems and ocean ecosystems. And then 15 life on land, which is this is actually referring more to the protection of forests and biodiversity. That is goal 15. And goal 16, another very, very important goal for indigenous peoples. Of course, all are relevant. Goal 16 is peace and justice and strong institutions. This in goal 16 is actually a very explicit reference to the need to protect, to respect and protect human rights. So this is where human rights, because human rights is related also to justice, right? So this is where a lot of the targets in the implementation of the human rights obligations of states are mentioned, and including an indicator on human rights violations, like, for example, what are the number of killings or execution or arbitrary arrest, meaning if a country have a high score on the number of arbitrary arrest and killings, that means they are not implementing their human rights obligation that is necessary for achieving sustainable development. So that is why it is clearly part of goal 16. Then finally, goal 17 is the partnerships for the goals. If you remember, I mentioned earlier that part of the means of implementation is partnerships. So 17 provides the means for implementations, that it is necessary to have a collaboration across the different development actors for all the 16 goals to be achieved. So governments, private sector, academe, civil society, social movements, professionals, etc., should do their part and contribute through partnerships to achieve the SDGs. So these are the 17 development goals. So if you look at the goals, do you think these are relevant to Indigenous peoples? Are they appropriate for Indigenous peoples? You can always respond in the chat. And now, if I link to your comments a while ago, you mentioned services, right? Somebody mentioned, wait, can we go back to the goals, please? Somebody mentioned about education, which is number 4. Somebody mentioned about jobs, which is number 8. Somebody mentioned about industrialization, which is 9. But also somebody mentioned that is also causing human rights violations. And we know that, for example, when they implement infrastructures, this is being imposed on us, which is leading to eviction or land grabbing, and thereby a violation of our rights under Goal 16, right? So you can see that what you have mentioned are covered by these 17 development goals. So can we move? Next, please. Next. Next, please. There. Now, just to capture, again, like I said a while ago, that the 17 goals is a result of a consultative process, including 9 major groups, including Indigenous peoples. Indigenous peoples is considered as one major group. But take note that women is also one major group. Youth is also one major group. Then you have farmers, then you have workers or trade unions, then you have the non-NGO as the other groups, and the other one is of course persons with disabilities. So I want to flag this because Indigenous women can also participate in the women's major group, not only in the Indigenous people's major group, but also to the women's major group, so that there is specific issues and concerns as Indigenous women should also be reflected in the interventions and demands and recommendations of the women major group. Now, the SDGs is also comprehensive because it covers the environment, social, and economic dimensions of sustainable development. This is a big difference to the Millennium Development Goals earlier, because that was only on economic dimensions. The main targets is only on economic dimensions. But now with the SDGs, it includes environment and social. And in the social component, this is where Indigenous people's rights is clearly part. When we talk about the social dimension, it involves the individual and collective rights of Indigenous peoples. The other point is that the SDGs is also more encompassing in terms of countries, that it does not only include developing countries, but also developed countries, which is again a difference in the MDGs before, because it was only dealing with developing countries. And this is again very, very significant for Indigenous peoples, because we know that in the developed countries, the most marginalized and heavily discriminated and are lacking social services are the Indigenous peoples. We see this in the US, in Canada, in Australia, for example, where while their country is considered highly developed or highly industrialized, the conditions of Indigenous peoples in those countries are very similar to the situation of Indigenous peoples in poorer countries or developing countries. So this is very significant for Indigenous peoples in developed countries. Now, it is also grounded on the Universal Declaration on Human Rights and other international human rights treaties. So, it's clear that we cannot achieve sustainable development without the realization of human rights. In fact, sustainable development should go hand in hand in the exercise and realization of human rights. You cannot delink or isolate the two, especially from the perspective of indigenous peoples, which I will elaborate later. And to support this, it seeks to realize the human rights of all, and it works for non-discrimination and equality. Take note, non-discrimination and equality. And this is again addressing the systemic problem that we face as indigenous peoples on the systemic discrimination and social inequality, including the lack of access to justice. Then finally, it pledges to leave no one behind, or leaving no one behind, and to reach those furthest behind first. And this commitment to reach those furthest behind first include indigenous peoples, because we are part of those furthest left behind. Okay, so this characterizes the process of the SDGs, but also the principles that underpin the sustainable development goals, or the SDGs. Next. Now we go to the specific reference to indigenous peoples in the goals and targets of the SDGs. In goal 2, in relation to zero hunger, take note that that's where indigenous peoples are clearly mentioned, that by 2030, double the agricultural productivity and incomes of the small-scale food producers, in particular women, indigenous peoples, family farmers, pastoralists, and fishers, including through secure, take note of this, through secure and equal access to land, other productive resources and inputs, knowledge, financial services, markets, and opportunities for value addition and non-farm employment. So this is where there's a clear target for indigenous people's inclusion, right? To address the goal of zero hunger. And this is very critical, because for us, as we all say, land is life and land is food. Land is many of us are saying, it's our grocery, it's our pharmacy. So this is where it clearly illustrates that point under target 2.3. The other one is in relation to the goal on quality education. The target again mentions that by 2030, eliminate gender disparities in education and ensure equal access to all levels of education and vocational training for the vulnerable, including persons with disabilities, indigenous peoples, and children in vulnerable situations. Take note here that it specifically mentions eliminate gender disparities in education, because we know across the globe, in all the different countries, that women are lagging behind in education. So there are 2 points here, women and indigenous people. So meaning, if we combine the two, the most left behind in terms of education are indigenous women, because of the intersectionality of the discrimination of indigenous women, as you can see here, right? That it clearly mentions gender disparities in education. And on top of that is also the disparity because of ethnicity as indigenous people. Then we see that many of the targets include data disaggregation by ethnicity, meaning that the targets, when they there's a specific mention of indigenous peoples, and where when they report on the achievements of progress in these targets, they should have a data specifically on ethnicity. And this is a very important point. This was a point that we really lobbied hard during the process, because without data disaggregation by ethnicity, it will not be clear on how indigenous peoples are being integrated. What is the level of progress on the inclusion of indigenous peoples? Like, for example, if there is a data when they say 50% of children have reached primary education, right? That's a very high achievement. But if you look into indigenous peoples in that 50%, majority are still not educated. 90% do not have education. But if you look at the broader, it is 50%, right? So without data disaggregation, we will not be able to identify the specific condition, progress or lack of progress on the implementation of the SDGs as it relates to indigenous peoples. The same on the target on the poverty, the same on the access to social services, so that is a very, very important point. Now, the other one that we have succeeded in the lobby, in the process of the SDGs, is the inclusion of indigenous peoples in the monitoring and reporting processes from national, regional to the global processes, which is the high-level political forum. This is actually a point that was added by the government of Mexico when we lobbied them for reference to make indigenous peoples visible in the political declaration. So it was the government of Mexico who added this, that indigenous peoples should be part of the monitoring and reporting process. Like, again, we will not be visible if there will be no monitoring and reporting of indigenous peoples at all levels. Okay, next point. Next slide, please. Okay, now this is the other very important that we need to understand is goal 5 on gender equality, or what is also called the empowerment of women and girls. And this refers to end discrimination and violence against women, yeah, including trafficking and elimination of harmful practices. So that's these are all relevant to indigenous women, of course. Special measures to combat discrimination, violence, and harmful practices developed and implemented with the full participation of indigenous women. So special measures, right? Special measures means that there should be laws, particular program, and budget allocation to address the situation of indigenous women in relation to violence and discrimination. So when we say special measures, it refers to putting something actionable points to change the situation, resources, laws, programs. So these are where special measures are needed. So it's not enough to only have a law, because even if you have a law, if there is no machinery to implement that law, right? So you need a body to implement that law. And even if there is a body, if there's no budget, then it will still not be implemented. So this three has to come together: policy, the means, the body to implement the policy, and the budget needed to support that. And then there's also the reforms to give women equal rights and access to ownership and control over land. Another critical point. But let me emphasize that from our perspective, we are not talking here of individual land rights. We are talking here of collective land rights for indigenous peoples, of which within that collective right is the right, equal rights of women to control over land. And the reason why I'm emphasizing this point is that it's clearly coming out that in national laws recognizing land rights, they are aiming to provide individual rights, women, men, because it's easier to pressure indigenous peoples to sell out their lands because it becomes a private property where the individual makes a decision. But when it is protected as a collective right, then everybody will have to give their consent before you can dispose, before you can sell. So collective rights has better protection than individual land rights. And in the case of India and in other countries, women are really saying that we need community land rights, collective rights first. Because the way the Community Forest Rights Act is being implemented is individual, and the land is titled in the name of the men. And men, because they can find jobs, easily sell the land because they say anyway they can find job. But for women, once they lose the land, where will they go? When their knowledge, their skills that they have developed through time is related to land management, related to conservation, related to food production. This will all be gone if they lose control of their land. So it has a more invaluable impact to women when women lose their land rights. But again, when we say land rights, it's in the context of collective land rights. Okay? Now, the other needed action when we say gender equality is the need for legislative reforms, capacity building, and support to Indigenous women's organizations to overcome barriers and ensure land rights for women. This is needed when we talk of reforms to give women, meaning that legislative reforms, like I mentioned, legislative reforms to recognize collective land rights and not just individual land rights. And that capacity building and support to women organizations, meaning providing literacy, for example, life skills for women, and building the leadership of women is necessary, including the recognition of the roles and contributions of women to food security, to transmission of knowledge, which is intergenerational transfer of knowledge, meaning that it's women ensuring that traditional knowledge is passed on from generation to generation to generation. And that will not happen. That will not happen if women lose control of their land, if women are taken away from their land, because the knowledge will not prosper, will not continue to be transferred to the next generation, right? And finally, to note, this is an update that further elaboration on the implementation of these targets in line with CEDAW as it applies to Indigenous women and girls is contained in the General Recommendations 39 of the CEDAW Committee. It's called the General Recommendation 39. I'm sure that this has also this is part of the discussion, but I just want to link this. Let's not look at this in isolation, right? to the SDG target on women, or in isolation to the need to recognize and respect women's rights, particularly the rights of women. So we should look at this in a holistic approach, not only in relation to sustainable development, but also in relation to non-discrimination, economic empowerment of women, and also in the issue of combating climate change and addressing biodiversity loss. Right? We need to look at it holistically. So the interlink is very, very important for us because it is underpinned by the need to recognize and respect the rights of Indigenous women as Indigenous and as part of the Indigenous and as women. This is indivisible from the realities and perspectives and aspirations of women, the indivisibility of the individual and collective rights of Indigenous women when we are talking of gender equality and of empowerment of women and girls. Next. Is my pace okay, or should I go faster? Can you give me a thumbs up? Good? Okay. Okay. Let's continue then. The next. Now, this is after presenting to you some of the specific reference to Indigenous peoples in the SDGs. This is also to emphasize the need for us to engage. Why are we engaging in the SDGs? The main objective is really to ensure the promotion and protection, recognition of the individual and collective rights of Indigenous peoples, including Indigenous women, youth and persons with disabilities, elderly, as affirmed by the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. This is the main objective of why we are engaging, because there are 2 points. One, some of our rights or many of our rights are at risk when they pursue sustainable development from the Western perspective, right? Like the targets, for example, on economic growth, the target on economic growth, industrialization, and even the target on climate change or conservation, because of the skewed view, like that the forest conservation can only happen when we are evicted from the forest, for example. So our forest rights are threatened when they do that kind of conservation, right? The same way when they say they protect the protection of oceans, where they want us to stop doing our traditional fishing when we are actually doing it in a sustainable manner. So those are examples of some threats, and this is actually happening. These are not just threats, right? Even now with the climate change. So it is important for us to engage to ensure the protection, recognition of our individual and collective rights. And this, we are not talking here of collective rights in the abstract. We're talking here of our right to our lands, territories, and resources, our right to self-determination, including self-determined development that we define how we want to develop, and the implementation of the free, prior, and informed consent, especially when they are making plans without our participation. And the right to cultural integrity and heritage. We cannot have development without our cultural integrity, right? That's why we always say our self-determined development accounts and takes full consideration to our cultural integrity and identity. And this is the kind of development that we pursue. We do not want to lose our dignity and our ethnicity, our distinct identity for in the name of development, right? So that's the first one. The second one is that development of special measures to that we need the development of special measures to protect the specific rights and address the specific conditions, needs, and priorities of Indigenous women, youth, persons with disabilities, elderly, and children. Now, I want to link this to the earlier discussion that I had on the issue of the needs and priorities of Indigenous women. It should be Indigenous women themselves who will identify their priorities and aspirations and nobody else, right? So in this respect, how do we end, for example, the early marriage for Indigenous girls? It should be women who will work on that. How do we ensure that Indigenous women are educated? What are the enabling environment? How do we enhance Indigenous women's leadership? What kind of capacity building or enabling environment do they need? How do we ensure that women go higher, right? That they can be political leaders at the national level. So there are needed steps, like they need to, it's not only literacy, but also the needed support, for example, of translation, because they cannot understand other languages, for example, right? So we need those special measures to create the enabling environment so that the full potential of Indigenous women is realized, that they are economically empowered and also politically empowered according to their aspirations, right? It's them to set that. So that's another area, so that we are not, it's not again that development will say, okay, you women stop doing your conservation and you work in factories and earn income. Is that what women want? Or they would rather continue producing food but needs tools to lessen the workload, for example. So I'm just citing clear examples so that we understand what we mean by this. Okay, then the third point is that promote the holistic approach of Indigenous peoples to development that cares for people and nature, including the sustainable practices of Indigenous peoples to resource management, food security, health and well-being, and as well as invaluable contributions to sustainable development, and that Indigenous peoples are development actors and rights. That this is one of the things. There are two. There's noise in the background. There are sorry, there's somebody speaking in the participants. Can you please mute? There are 2 points here on the holistic approach. The holistic approach carries what we mean the principles of sustainability and reciprocity that we carry as Indigenous peoples, right? That we live in harmony with nature and that we also care for each other, that we have solidarity, cooperation, because we need that to survive collectively. The other point is that that we as Indigenous peoples are development actors and rights holders, meaning we are not just vulnerable groups that is needing assistance, that is needing charity. We are not asking for charity, right? That is not what we are asking. What we are asking is support, solidarity for us to be able to continue to do our contributions. Because it is the outside intervention that is also undermining our own development. At the same time, we need appropriate services. Health, for example, education that recognizes our language, for bilingual education or education in mother tongue, for example. Those are the things that we need. We need support for our sustainable livelihoods, but not charity, right? Because we have those rights. We have the rights to manage our resources. And we just need support to be able to do that in an optimal way, and that is sustainable, and that our identity and our culture are still respected. So those are the points there. But also I want to emphasize that under the holistic approach, the thing that we need to hammer or emphasize is that we as Indigenous peoples always think of the common good. That is a value and a principle that we practice. That is against greed, that we uphold common good, right? And so when we, for example, have excess production, when we our mango tree have a lot of fruits, we share it. When we have a lot of vegetables, we share it, because it's a common good we need to share. It's the culture of sharing. It's the principle of sharing. That is the big difference with the Western concept of development, that you develop as an individual. You don't share, you just pursue your individual career. That is not how we want. We want to share. We want that to treat everything as a common good. We do not privatize for a personal interest. And that is the value that is needed now in the crisis in relation to climate change, but also the unsustainable path of development, right? So we need to emphasize, we need to reflect, we need to revive those values and principles. And women are the best actors, the best practitioners of these principles and values. Do you agree with me? Yeah. Okay. Finally, is the ensure the effective participation and inclusion of Indigenous peoples in the SDG processes from local, national, regional, and global processes levels in the context of leaving no one behind, to include Indigenous women, youth, persons with disabilities. Because the slogan, the call of the SDGs is leaving no one behind. And what's happening to us is that we are not just left behind, we are pushed behind even. And why do I say we are pushed behind? Our lands and resources are being grabbed or destroyed in the name of development. We are again being sacrificed, right? So this the effective participation and inclusion of Indigenous peoples is necessary if states are really serious in their call for leaving no one behind, because we know better how our development should be realized. Okay, and that is to ensure that our perspectives, our aspirations are reflected in the SDG, in the plans. And that can only be achieved if we effectively participate. They cannot determine that for us. It should come from us. Okay? Okay, next. I think I will now go quicker. I'm emphasizing more on the, so now this is the different layers, right? The different levels of the SDGs. The national level is where each government conduct regular and inclusive reviews or progress, review of progress, which requires the participation of civil society when they do the review of any progress in the implementation of the SDGs. Then at the regional level, they have the regional forum, right? The UN regional commissions convene the regional forums for sustainable development for regional follow-up and review. And this happens before the high-level political forum every year. So the high-level political forum, which is the global level, below, happens every July. So the regional forum starts February and March. This is done in Asia, Africa, Latin America, And then we also have, of course, in the Middle East. So the regional review process also includes the participation of the 9 major groups. That includes indigenous peoples. So in Asia, for example, this is the Asia Pacific. It always happens in Bangkok, in the region, the Asia Pacific Economic UNESCAP Economic and Social ESCAP action plan, I think. This is happening, and it's already over. The one in Asia, I think it's also over in Africa. So it's only Latin America before the high-level political forum in July. The one in July in the United Nations high-level political forum, which is the global review process, is under the ECOSOC, the Economic and Social Council, of the UN. So this is the development arm of the UN. The human rights arm is the Human Rights Council based in Geneva, and the development arm is the ECOSOC based in New York. Okay, so these are the 3 layers. Next. Now the process at the national level. No, so I said, so we look at the layer. So at the national level, states shall develop national action plans, right, to implement the 2030 agenda and conduct regular and inclusive reviews. Like I said, that they should include the 9 major groups, and when they do the evaluation or assessment on how they are implementing the national action plan based on the 17 SDGs and targets. Now, the national action plans should be consistent with the principles of the SDGs, the balanced implementation of the environment, social, and economic dimensions, and prioritize those left behind, and should be inclusive and transparent process and accountable, and it should respect human rights. Unfortunately, while this is the commitment of many governments, this is not the reality on the ground. National action plans are still largely, in paper, so to speak. And it's, again, more on the economic dimension rather than the environment and social. And then the states are expected to hold consultations with indigenous peoples in the preparation of their national report. It's called the Voluntary National Review Report on the implementation of the SDGs. This report is presented in the regional and the global review process. And they do present their report, but then remember that in the global review and under the high-level political forum, every state is only given 15 minutes. Now it's even down to 10 minutes to report. So it's practically a report, or it's almost like an ad for tourism. The reports are all praising themselves, and there's no interaction with civil society or other states. So it becomes problematic because there is no honest to goodness discussion on the level of implementation in terms of progress and gaps. Now, at the national level, each country is expected to report to the global review, right? Like I mentioned, for at least once in every or 5 years, succeeding years of the SDG implementation from 2016 to 2030. Meaning, if we follow this, each country will report at least 3 times within the 15 years of implementation. But many countries are actually volunteering because it's voluntary. Some countries are already reporting for the 3rd time because they said that in the early reporting period, they haven't done much. Now they want to implement more. In any case, what are the challenges and gaps on the implementation? The global, in February, this is already based on the report on the Global Sustainable Development Report, raises serious concerns that the SDG implementation of 4 years is not only lagging in all the goals, but in fact is regressing, particularly on biodiversity conservation and forest protection. The and also in terms of widening inequality within and between countries. And remember what happened after February 2020 is the pandemic. We are just recovering from the pandemic. So with the pandemic, we're really lagging behind in the implementation of the SDGs. Because even before the pandemic happens, we are not on track. And some of the goals are even regressing. And these are the goals that are very, very significant to Indigenous peoples: biodiversity conservation and forest protection, and the issue of inequality, right? And then there is also, like I mentioned a while ago, the issue of the 3 dimensions, the imbalance. There's lack of policy coherence in relation to the 3 dimensions of economic, social, and economic, social, and what's the other one? I forgot. Political dimensions of the SDGs, and also addressing systemic barriers of the inequality and sustainable development, particularly in relation to unsustainable production and consumption, environmental destruction, and continuing the linking of human rights obligations and accountability of states. Meaning many states now still, this is, and this I tell you, when you raise human rights in New York as the headquarters of development, they say, no, this is not where human rights is being discussed. Go to Geneva to discuss human rights. You don't come to New York to discuss human rights. We discuss development here. So clearly, they're delinking, but from our perspective, or from the perspective of sustainable development, we cannot have sustainable development. We cannot have social equity without the respect for human rights. It's just not, it will only be the development for the rich. It will only be the development for the few, right? And not achieving equality and non-discrimination. So that is still the state of affairs in the SDG implementation. And like I mentioned earlier, Indigenous peoples is still considered mainly as vulnerable group at all levels, not as rights holders and development actors. Unfortunately, this is still the regard of many states to Indigenous peoples. And then there is a need for enabling environment for the meaningful participation and inclusion of Indigenous peoples in the implementation of the SDGs, because in many of the national action plans or in many of the reports, we are still invisible, even in countries where there are Indigenous peoples, though there is also a trend of increasing, right, which is positive, increasing reference to Indigenous peoples in the national and regional reporting, and also at the global. So we are increasingly becoming visible, but not substantive enough, right? To reach the realization of our development aspirations. That our development aspirations are still not fully included and accounted in the SDG plans. And so in this regard, Indigenous peoples are invisible in global, regional, and national partnerships to support the implementation of the SDGs. Public-private partnerships continue to promote business as usual approach to development, which is not transformational and can exacerbate inequality. Take note that the means of implementation is partnerships. And we are lagging behind in terms of education, and nobody is partnering directly with Indigenous peoples, for example, for mother tongue education. No, very few. And this is and we need partnerships. We need partnerships to provide, for example, renewable energy. We need partnerships for clean water to reach our communities, right? But that is not happening. And even with UN agencies are saying that why they want to partner with Indigenous peoples, they do not have the resources. They are not given the substantive budget to be able to support the the SDG implementation in indigenous territory, which is really sad, no? And finally, leaving no one behind remains a lip service for indigenous peoples and marginalized sectors. We are still being left behind, and not only left behind, but pushed behind further because of the continuing land grabbing and destruction of our resources, which we need to be able to pursue our own development and aspirations, right? So finally, what we can do at the national level, in spite of those developments, it's still important for us to engage. Like I said, our rights is at stake, but also there's still opportunity for us to get our issues visible, including our aspirations. So with this, we need to collaborate with the National Statistical Office to ensure collection of disaggregated data based on indigenous identity in national surveys and censuses, develop complementarity with national indicators to monitor specific aspects of indigenous people's rights and development based on ethnicity. Because unless there is data disaggregation, we will not know the level of progress or lack of progress in relation to our inclusion, in the achievement of the SDGs. Then undertake participatory community data collection to track and report progress. So this is our effort. We should not just also wait for the national statistics, but we do. For example, if education is not reaching our communities, then we should make a report on that. If our women continue to be victims of violence, if women are being trafficked, if our lands are being grabbed and communities are evicted, because this increase also the vulnerability of women to violence when they are taken out of our territories. So these are needed. These are what we can do, and monitor and document the condition of indigenous communities in relation to goals and targets, including on human rights violation cases, because that means the obligations and commitment of states are not being implemented in relation to human rights protection. And conduct media outreach to generate public attention to the issues, concerns, and aspirations of indigenous peoples in relation to the SDGs. So for example, for women, it's important for media to know what do they want in terms of development. When they say economic empowerment of indigenous women, what is economic empowerment for them? They should be able to define, and this should be articulated so that we mainstream what is sustainable development for us, right? Sustainable development for us is not resource extraction. It's sustainable resource management and conservation, right? It's ensuring food security. So those are the things that we should be able to articulate, so that it's not only the government perspective or the Western perspective that is getting public awareness or attention, and that we bridge the notion that we are against development, that we are backward, because that is still the prevailing narrative, that we are anti-development. But we are not anti-development. We are actually working for sustainable development. Okay, and then engage in national consultation processes and reporting to the voluntary national review and to the high-level political forum, like I said, which is the global forum, but also in the regional forum, which happens before the high-level political forum. Okay, next. Next, please. Next slide. Now, the other one that we also need to do is to engage with key government agencies and bodies, because they are the ones mandated to implement the SDGs. So these are, for example, bodies that are really on economic development, on tourism, for example, on conservation, minerals, etc. These are the government bodies, and many of their plans are actually in violation of indigenous people's rights. It's also important to engage with local governments, especially in areas where majority are indigenous peoples, and this is what they call localizing the SDGs. And this is possible, right? Especially in areas where we have the support or many of the LGUs, the members of the local governments, are indigenous themselves and sympathetic. Then, because it appears like it's non-political, right? The issue of sustainable development. So it's easier to bridge cooperation because we're dealing with education, health, livelihoods, you know, it's easier to talk with local governments on those issues, right? So it's good to engage also with local governments. And I mentioned already the statistics office, but also here it is important to engage with national human rights institutions or commission to highlight cases of human rights violations. Because they do, they are seen as more credible if they report cases of human rights violations. Because if we report, they're saying that we invent the, you know. So if we have the national human rights institutions reporting on human rights violations, then it gets more attention. Okay, next. Okay, now the UN agencies and the UN country teams have the mandate to fully support the implementation of the SDGs. So they become our allies on the SDG implementation because UN agencies and UN country teams are also obligated to respect human rights. They have that, right? Because they are a UN body. So these are the focus of the UN agencies, so that you are aware. The UNDP or UN Development Program leads Goal 1. This is where they are providing support on ending poverty, but also Goal 16. And what is Goal 16? The peace, strong institutions, justice, and human rights. So they are also the one working together with the Office of the High Commissioner, no, the Goal 16. The UN Food and Agricultural Development, or FAO, is of course on hunger. UN Women is on Goal 5, and ILO on Goal 8, and UNESCO on Goal 4. So these are the UN agencies. So when you come to the permanent forum, this, and you want to work on the SDGs, you can talk to these agencies on this, right? But even, for example, women issues is not only limited to UN Women. UN Food and the FAO, women are mainly food producers as well. So women's rights is also important for the issue of food security. The same on ending poverty, right, and decent work. So it's all, these are all relevant to indigenous women, and not just on the UN Women on Goal 5. Yeah, and the restructuring now of the UN is the UN country team. The UN country team as a whole has a priority. They are given the priority now to support national governments for the SDG implementation, and for them to also work with civil society. That includes indigenous peoples, and indigenous peoples as rights holders, and not only as vulnerable group. So it's important to reach out to the UN country teams to discuss what are the issues and concerns of indigenous peoples, and specifically also indigenous women, in relation to the SDGs. What are their needs and priorities that these agencies can support or bring it to the attention, because they can help bring attention to these concerns with the governments, because they work with governments. There is no way that UN country team it will only work with civil society. That is not going to happen, because they are created to support primarily the government, but they also have the mandate to work with civil society, and that's where we can come in. So they can play that bridging role, right? Especially if the governments are so anti-Indigenous peoples, then we can use the UN country teams to help us, assist us, bring our concern to the government. Yeah, okay, next. Okay, the other actors are of course other civil society, no? So it's all the building allies with other sectors for common issues, like with farmers groups, women's groups, youth groups. It's important that we work with them so that they can also help us bring the issues of Indigenous peoples in the national SDG action plan, that they support it, right? Because it's difficult if it's only us, especially if we are very small in the country that we work on. And then we can also build strength and solidarity and collaboration with them through joint advocacies and support through capacity building. They can also support participation of Indigenous peoples at national, regional, and global levels, and can support the initiatives of Indigenous peoples for self-determined development. So this, we can use the SDG as a platform to generate support, no, for the self-determined needs and priorities of Indigenous peoples. But what we need to ensure is that we will continue to speak for ourselves as Indigenous peoples while we build alliances. Because in certain countries where NGOs are so dominant that they want to even speak for Indigenous peoples, no? So we should not also allow that. But in certain situations, that is allowed where security is a main concern, where Indigenous peoples are being targeted. So it's good that it's NGOs is speaking, and so there are situations where it can also be we do not attract more risks, no? Okay, next. I think next point. Next, please. I think we're now going to, yes. So now, just to bring you to the high-level political forum this year, which is happening in New York on July 10 to 19. The theme is accelerating the recovery from the coronavirus disease, COVID-19, and the full implementation of the 2030 Agenda for Development at all levels. So that's the theme. It's still within the recovery, because we are economically recovering still from the COVID. And then it will also be a review, mid-review, no, of where we are, although it's already clear that we are way lagging behind. So it's really on how to fast track implementation. So the focus goals, every high-level political forum, while it should be still an interlinked approach, the focus will be on goal 6, which is in clean water and sanitation, goal 7 on affordable and clean energy, goal 9 on industry, innovation, and infrastructure, and 11 on sustainable cities and communities, and 17 on partnership for goals. Goal 17 is always a standing agenda every high-level political forum, because it deals with the means of implementation, right? So these are the focus goals. So it would be important for us to also highlight our concerns and our recommendations in relation to these goals. Okay, next. So these are now the country that will report, right? So I marked the countries with Indigenous people. So if you happen to be in these countries, please collaborate with the IPMG and FIMI in the preparation of your shadow reports, right? So I'm not sure about the participants, but at least these are the countries that will be reviewed this year in July. Okay, next. So these are just if you belong to any of these countries, these are the related materials and reports already submitted. So you will know what your government has reported so far, no, in the implementation of SDGs. So I think this is the last slide. Sorry for taking quite some time, but I hope that has been useful. So questions now? Do you have any questions?
Thank you, Joan, for sharing that with us. So, sisters, if you have any questions or comments related to what you just had, please, you can put your hand up or you can write it on the chat so that Joan can respond to it.
Johnny.
Sorry. Johnny, please go ahead.
Oh, gracias, buenos días. Muchísimas gracias, Joan, por
Thank you so much, Joan. Good morning. Thank you so much for such valuable information. My question is, how can we know if our governments are including in their agendas their SDGs? How can we know that? Thank you.
Yeah. Okay. They are submitting reports to the high-level political forum, and it's published. If you open the website of the SDG, the 2030 agenda, high-level political forum, like I showed you in the last slide, right? Those are reports submitted by your government earlier, and they will submit reports. So take note that these are compiled by the UN and it's published in the website of the UN. But the part of the process is that government should actually do consultations as part of the process of preparing their report. So meaning if they haven't done consultations with indigenous peoples, most likely you are not mentioned, or that you are mentioned in not necessarily from your evaluation, but from the government perspective. Yeah. I hope that answers your question.
Muchas gracias.
Muchas
Thank
gracias.
you very much.
And also Joy has put the link to the website on the chat, so you can take a look.
Yeah.
Juliana.
Gracias,
Thank
gracias maestra por tan
Thank you, Teacher Joan, for giving us such an important presentation. Honestly, seeing the Sustainable Development Goals has filled us with such satisfaction because there have been a lot of progress in terms of, the recognition of indigenous people's rights. And in this case, I think the SDG agenda, well, we know that it's mentioning indigenous people specifically. They're including us in some of the objectives, but we know that this is a challenge for our countries. It's a challenge to make the recognition of our rights real, because I remember in 2016, trying to get the country to recognize the rights of indigenous people was still a very arduous, slow job. So I wonder, how did you get there in other places? And I know that besides the reports, we also have shadow reports where it specifies that many of the things that the main report says are not real.
Yeah.
And I like that that exists, that the shadow report says no, what they're saying is not exactly true. So how have you been able to, get real recognition? How has the process been?
Yeah. The process is because major groups are recognized, no, as part of the process. So major groups can submit a report, and it can also be published in the website. So that's how we can counter also what the government are saying. So it's important that's why I was emphasizing the need for us to document, to make reports of our situation, because we can counter the lies, the misinformation being done by the government, no, by using the platform. Also the IPMG puts it in its website, but it's also put in the, as long as we submit it on time, it's also put in the high level in the HLPF website. So because we are recognized as one of the major groups, so that's a very positive development also.
Right. Brittany? Brittany, you can go ahead.
Brittany.
Yeah.
Buenos días, hermanas. ¿Me logran escuchar?
Hello, sisters. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah.
Ya. Hermana, yo quisiera consultar. Buenos días con todos. Muchas gracias.
Good morning, everybody. Sister, thank you so much for all the information you've given us. I have a question.
Mhm.
Estos objetivos al momento de ser monitoreados, por lo que le he escuchado es que cada país da un
These
informe, ¿no?
objectives,
Informes
I heard that
si están
every country has to present a report to see,
elaborando
to say whether they are, complying with the SDGs, or if they're creating policies to mitigate poverty, climate impact, and basically align their policies with the SDGs.
Yes.
My consultation would be,
si al momento de hacer este monitoreo se hace
during the
un estudio
monitoring
en el país,
process,
digamos, ¿no?
is
O
there
es
a
algo
study
desconocido,
done in the
porque
in
yo
the country,
he estado
or
trabajando
it
con
wasn't
una
possible? Because, for example,
pública en Perú,
I worked for a
donde
public
bueno,
body in
el
Peru,
papel, en un papel se puede escribir
and
todo,
as you
se
said,
puede
you can write
acordar
whatever you
todo,
want on a paper. You can put,
acá en las oficinas donde
whatever
trabajo,
you
las
want on a
oficinas en
paper,
Peru, está todo.
and as
Yo no
my
entendía,
boss used to say,
pero
the
una vez que
the
tuve
paper can hold
un trabajo
anything.
de
But
campo
once I had to
allá
leave the
con la
office to
población,
do
en este caso la
work
directa
on the
comunitaria
ground,
para
in
poder
this case, to
implementación
find
política,
the directly
me
affected
dijo,
population
no,
for
no
a
voy a hacer
project
el
of public
trabajo,
investment,
solamente hay que
they
copiarlo.
told me, oh, you don't
Yo
need
le
to
digo,
go on
pero
the
no vamos
field.
a
You
ver
just have
cómo
to, you
podemos
can
hacer aquí
copy
los
just what we have.
apellidos, ¿no?
And I said, well,
Y
I
me
have
dice,
to
no,
go
no,
there to
hágame el
find
favor,
out how many people
Yeah.
have been affected. And they said,
tómelo de
no,
ese
just
fondo y
copy it from
póngalo
the
aquí.
system and just put
Entonces
it
yo
in there.
ahí me di cuenta que
And that's when I
ellos no
realized
están
that
cumpliendo, ¿no?
at the end of the day,
Solamente
they're not
en papel
complying.
se
On the
dice
paper,
Yeah.
que se
yes,
cumple o que
they
están
look
operando,
great. They say that they're doing great, that they are
se puede
mitigating
celebrar, se
climate
puede
change,
firmar,
eradicating poverty,
pero
the
no se,
poverty,
eso no se cumple
but
realmente. Entonces,
I
al
see that they're
saberlo,
not
me pongo
really
a pensar y digo,
Yeah.
complying.
tal
So I
vez
started
Yeah.
thinking and I
alguna
wondered,
institución está
what if
haciendo algún estudio
is
de
the
que vaya a ver
UN or any other
se
organisms,
toma en
are
cuenta,
they
que sea
doing any
realizado,
studies to see
todo eso.
if the governments
Esa es
are
mi
really
pregunta.
consulting the indigenous people?
Yes, they do. That's also why, for example, the report that I mentioned was a UN report where it's clear that there is regression, that biodiversity loss instead of biodiversity protection. The deforestation has even worsened instead of protection. Inequality has even worsened. That is a UN report. So that's also why I was saying that it's good to work with the UN country teams and the UN agencies, because they can take the information from you, right, and include it in their report. So it counters also the government report. Aside from you making your own report, and what's powerful is also using pictures, right? Like they say, oh, no more poverty, or children are going to school, then you can counter with actual photos on the ground that that's not true. So it's also our, let's also take it as our responsibility to present the realities on the ground, to present the truth, but also to present what is our aspiration, what do we want, so that that is also mainstream, so that they are also pressured to answer why they are not addressing what we need or what our priorities are, so that we're not just saying the bad things, but we're also saying this is what we want, and you can partner with us so that we can pursue this, right? So if we present it like that, then we put the government in a defensive position, and we can build more partnerships. So we are saying we are supporting the sustainable development, and this is our offer. You partner with us so we can work together, right? Yeah. Okay. Any more questions?
I had seen
Gracias.
Professor Ansa had put her hand up. So just as we wait for the sisters to maybe put their hands up, Professor, you can give your comment or your question. Professor Ansa, you had put.
I'm sorry, Winnie, I did not fully hear. Thank you so much, John, for giving us this seminar. I really consider your seminars the most authoritative. I always enjoy them. They are amazing. And you know, I wanted to say that if we compare the MDGs to the SDGs, the SDGs are much better because they give us a lot of human rights elements in there. They talk about data disaggregation and non-discrimination. That's great stuff. And they do mention indigenous peoples, while the MDGs did not at all.
Yeah, yes.
So it is better. But of course, there are the challenges that you mentioned. I think that it's not just in 7 points that the indigenous peoples are mentioned that is relevant, but in everything, as you said. What I wanted to ask you is, given that this is a better framework and indigenous peoples have been much more organized to push their issues through the SDGs, do you have any good examples? Because, you know, I know it's very hard work, all this, you know, and it goes fast and it's intensive. But if we have a good example where, for example, indigenous intervention has created good reaction, it would be good to know why and to analyze it and to share it with the indigenous leadership, you know. So that is my question. And if on indicators you have something else to tell us. I mean, I know the effort that in the indicators for SDGs indigenous peoples were pursuing, and it didn't come in. It was not included. But is there something in practical terms being done at country level? Your wisdom on this. Thank you.
Yeah. The one that we're citing as a good example is the case of Norway, where they actually had consultations with the Sami Parliament and the Sami Council when they were formulating their National Action Plan on SDGs. So there were consultations conducted, but then not the whole recommendations made by the Sami were integrated. They said some, but for example, their recommendations on health and control of their lands, for example, were not included. But they said that at least that's a good practice of their consultation, and they were even part of the delegation of the Norwegian government during the high-level political forum, where one of the Sami youth even spoke during the reporting period. So they're showing that they have indigenous peoples with them, right? Canada also, when they shifted, when they're now supporting the UN DRIP, they're making more efforts to include indigenous peoples. And when they reported in the high-level political forum, the Willie Little Child was part of their delegation. However, because of the limited time, he was not able to speak, but they were showing that they have the indigenous. And that's not common, right? I mean, that the government official, the delegation includes indigenous in their delegation, acknowledging at the outset that they have indigenous and they're addressing the development needs of these indigenous people. So those are the two so far. And then the other one is the localization being done in Hawaii and under the US, right? Because Hawaii is, in a state. So at the local level, they're also they're indigenizing the SDG plan in Hawaii. So they're incorporating the aspirations of the indigenous peoples in Hawaii in making that. So that is an example of a local SDG action plan where there's a lot of participation, not only indigenous organizations, but indigenous in the academic world. Because a lot of are in the academic, so they have also participated. So that's another example of this. Now, in relation to indicators and targets, that's really where it's still a major challenge. In terms of data, though, Latin American countries are leading because they have the body, right? The statistical body at the regional level that is already doing data disaggregation. So in the data disaggregation in Latin America, it's obviously showing that indigenous peoples are lagging behind. Data on education, data on access to health services, data on employment or economic access to economic resources. It is still showing that. So that is a very rich source of data. What disaggregated data, and this because this is already happening way before the SDGs, right? That because of ILO 169 in many countries. So that was a big factor of why data disaggregation is being done in Latin America. It's Asia that is really way behind in terms of data disaggregation. But as I mentioned earlier, that there is now increasing reference to indigenous peoples in the VNR reports. More and more countries are mentioning indigenous peoples in the report, but again, it may not be true, right? What they're saying, but at least the visibility is there. That means there's more awareness now to include indigenous people, either the wrong way or right way, but at least you're making it's visible. So I think that's one of the contributions of the SDG now. Is it really increased the visibility of indigenous peoples, and it's also now changing the narrative about us being just vulnerable, right? That we are not just vulnerable. So while that is still dominant, it's already shifting. The narrative is already shifting, as we can also feel in the climate change. There's already acknowledgement that we are contributing. Our knowledge is critical in addressing climate change, that our conservation, that we have our territories have the most diverse biodiversity protection, right? So those are now emerging, no, at least at the global level. But the problem is the realities on the ground is not really significantly changing. So that's still where we need to put stronger attention, but that really matters on the political situation in each country, because if you have a repressive government, then there's not really much that you can do except to deal with the human rights, right? So that's really where we are now. And with COVID, again, with the COVID, it also shows that we were really even pushed way behind by COVID. So what we have gained, the little thing that we have gained has set us back because of COVID. Yeah.
Thank you, Joan.
Thank
there was
you.
There's a question, or rather a comment on the chat, and can
Yeah, our interpreter read
Magdalene,
it.
yeah, can you
Hello,
please
yes,
help
I
us?
can interpret it. Bridani Pereira is saying, thank you very much, sister. I'll have another question. How can we report anything that is not true? And if it's would it be confidential so we can avoid retaliation from the government?
Yes, you can, and you can do it through the IPMG, the Indigenous Peoples Major Group for Sustainable Development. Timmy can share to you the contacts, but also with us in the Indigenous Peoples Rights International, especially if it's dealing with repression, because that's also where we work, and we give confidential information without naming the source. No, we have good relations with the Office of the High Commissioner, and so far all the cases that we have submitted, there was a communication done by the special rapporteur on these cases of severe violation, or if you think but if it relates on more on the lack of education, those things, then the IPMG, that they can integrate that in the overall report without mentioning the source, right? Because we don't have to mention the organizations when the IPMG make the submission, so it's fine. The source can be confidential. Yeah, so please, I encourage you to submit those kind of reports and data, because those are what we need to counter, right, false information from governments.
Sister Elizabeth Olvera is saying, this goals should have also included all the indigenous peoples of the world so that they would be part of this building, because
Yes.
we are still waiting to be taken into account as political subjects with all full rights.
Yes. Yes.
And Sister Brittany says, thank you, sister. Thank you very much.
Yes. Okay, thank you. Thank you, everyone. And I wish you the best in completing this course. And I hope to meet you somewhere maybe in the high-level political forum or in the permanent forum, but wish you the best.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Joan, and thank you for coming to speak to us. We have something small, just a recognition for you that we'll also share via email from all of us. As the International Indigenous Women's Forum, in recognition to Joan Carling for the participation and contribution in the capacity building of Indigenous women leaders from Africa, Asia, Latin America, North America, and the Pacific during the 10th edition of the Program on Human Rights and International Advocacy Skills with Gratitude, and it's signed by Teresa Zapata. So thank you so much, Joan.
Thank you.
Thank you for sharing your experience and your knowledge with us on the stages, and hopefully we all of us or one of us will get to meet you in the upcoming meetings. Bye, and we wish you the best. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.
So sisters, thank you. We have our next class on Friday, and there is some reading material that will be shared with all of you. So please make sure that you read it before the session with Professor Elsa. So we'll share the reading material with you today, so that you have time to read it before our Friday sessions. So I wish you a good day for those who are starting your day, and a good evening or good night to those of us who are now later in the day, and I'll see you on Friday. Bye everyone, and take care.
Bye-bye.
Bye, Professor. I'll see you on Friday.
Bye.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.